Biden said, and something we have talked about this morning, this idea of being a peace baby. You were born not long after the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Do you think that message that Biden tried to force home, that this was all about the future, will have reached those that it needs to?
I certainly hope it does, because as you rightly allude to, we've got a whole generation of young people now. I'm teetering on the edge of that categorisation at the moment, but we've got a whole generation of young people now who are coming through. They've had a very different experience of what it is just to live in Northern Ireland, to be from Northern Ireland, what it is to understand the conflict in Northern Ireland. You know, it's not a lived memory of what happened in the past for the majority of people of the post-98 era. So there's a very different way of thinking about not just what Northern Ireland needs to be, but what it ought to be. And very much the speech from President Biden today alluded to all of that, you know, speaking about the future, speaking about the opportunities, speaking about making it a place that harnesses the opportunities that younger people in that post-Good Friday Agreement era can bring to Northern Ireland. And I think that's something that will land very positively on ears listening to it.
And I suppose the question now will be that talk of inward investment once governance comes back, how much that does encourage those leaders who need to hear that to step back into power sharing.
Well, that's it, and we've heard very clearly from the DUP that nothing around the Good Friday Agreement events or celebrations, commemorations, whichever phraseology you wish to use around it, is going to in any way change their perspective in terms of a return to power sharing. They've been very clear that they will make up their own mind in their own time as and when that might be. So we're not going to see a huge change today, but certainly, you know, if we're coming up to a council elections here next month in Northern Ireland, and if you've got people on the doorsteps that are perhaps reflecting on the words of President Biden today, thinking about the wider issues in Northern Ireland, cost of living, healthcare, you know, those normal things that are impacting people. And of course, if we're looking at the theme of younger people, the opportunities, jobs, security, being able to find a home, all of those things feeding in, then it's going to be very difficult for the politicians on the doorsteps over the next number of weeks to avoid conversations like that. And that in itself might be enough to change the way people are thinking about politics.
It is interesting to think, you know, the elections are coming on the 18th of May, and it's how voters will feel having heard this, you know, a month prior to them casting their ballots. I presume that the parties in the run-up to those elections will be talking about the possibility of inward investment if we can get governance going again.
Absolutely, and you know, there's almost an additional incentive there. You know, so we had the parties that would have been talking about those sorts of things anyway, but now that you have the additional impetus of President of the United States who has come to Northern Ireland, we've got the trade envoy with him as well, in Joe Kennedy. You know, it's been very clearly stated, if you can get governance going again, then these are the opportunities you can have. But I think it's important to caveat that by saying this is a council election that we're talking about, and it's the Assembly, which is a completely different political sphere that we're looking at here. But it's difficult to disentangle one from the other in terms of the trickle-down effect within the political parties themselves and how they might be thinking about taking things forward. And
also, it's just going to be a bellwether, isn't it, as to how they're feeling and how much not being in power sharing may well have damaged the parties. I mean, we've heard from Jeffrey Donaldson this morning, we've heard from Jim Shannon that nothing has changed from what they've heard from the President. What's your sense of a timeline here? Because, you know, Jim Shannon wouldn't be sort of pressed on it, but it's very difficult to see. This has to come to an end at some point, doesn't it?
It does, and the DUP is in a very difficult position because they've taken such clear, hard positions with regard to so many different issues, not least around Brexit and the Windsor Framework, that effectively they're at a situation now where, if I can use clunky language, they have to back down on some level. It's just how high a rung that they have set for themselves at this stage, you know, as to how big a leap that will be. But I think in terms of a timeline, we're not going to see anything more than likely before the council elections. I would imagine we won't see anything this side of the summer. If there's going to be any sort of imminent movement, I am mooting my suggestions around autumn time perhaps, but who knows what could happen in the meantime.
Let's go back inside the room a little bit, and I wonder if we can see pictures of President Biden's speech and those that were assembled there. We know that he had conversations with those five party leaders. We saw that Jeffrey Donaldson, First Minister designate, was sitting next to, Deputy First Minister designate was sitting next to the First Minister designate, Michelle O'Neill. I mean, the seats will have been set, but just the fact of them sitting together, there's a symbolic edge to that, isn't there, as well?
Absolutely, and you know, we don't have the political arena where we see those normal sort of interactions that we would have seen when the institutions were functioning. This is one of the very few and rare occasions since the executive was collapsed last February where we actually see the leading figures sitting beside each other, talking with each other. Albeit, you know, there's limited footage, of course, you know, they weren't the focus in the room, but there didn't seem to be much by way of conversation there from what I did pick up. I may be corrected on that if anybody was sitting watching them. But ultimately, you know, that kind of symbolism is extremely important, because we have the hardline narratives that come through, particularly around the more salient issues in Northern Ireland, that seem to pit the parties against each other to a certain extent. And then you realise that actually there is a commonality there, there is space for them to be able to work together. It's not new, they've managed to achieve it for quite a relatively considerable amount of time before the collapse in 2017. So there is an opportunity there, but it's a matter of, and it's no small matter, and I don't wish to downplay it, it's a matter of being able to overcome those differences and those narratives to make politics work, despite what might be happening on the outside.
Yeah, let me just stop you there, Dr. Rice, because as you can see on your screens there, the front of the picture is the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Jeffrey Donaldson, walking away from the speech. Mr. Donaldson saying that he's quite clear that President Biden's words have not changed anything. I'll see if I can have a word with him. He's going to be speaking to, I think, our senior Ireland correspondent. Mr. Donaldson, did anything that Mr. Biden said change your feeling about power sharing here?
No.
Quite clearly a no from Mr. Donaldson there. Our senior Ireland correspondent David Blevins is trying to get hold of him. Mr. Donaldson, what will change your opinion on power sharing? How will you get back into power sharing? Mr. Donaldson saying that there could be a solution, but not elaborating on that at all. It's good to see Mr. Donaldson come through, and I'm glad that he came this way along. I'm sure he's going to be spoken to by David Blevins, and we'll get some more detail on exactly on how he felt coming out of that speech. And that's really the issue, isn't it? It is in Mr. Donaldson's hands as to whether or not the power sharing is restored.
Yeah, I'm always reluctant to reduce power sharing and the political spectrum in Northern Ireland to focus on one party. But in this case, all of the other political parties in Northern Ireland are saying that they are keen to get back into power sharing. And of course, it's the DUP and the TUV, but they have one MLA. It's the DUP majoritively that are saying we won't do this, we won't countenance this until our issues and concerns around the protocol Windsor framework have been resolved. So the power very much is in their hands now. For quite some time, it was over in the hands of Westminster. It was external to Northern Ireland. Now with the Windsor framework, it's back within Northern Ireland, and it really is difficult to say just how things will pan out in that regard, because there are a few different ways that the DUP could react to the Windsor framework, a few different ways in which they could choose to proceed, not least based on the results that come through from the council elections next month. So it is all to play, but you're very correct in saying at the moment that it is very much all eyes on the DUP in that regard.
Yeah, and of course Mr. Johnson has to cajole different wings of the party to get them behind him if he was to choose to try and bring power sharing back. Dr. Rice, do stay with us in a moment, because I'm trying to cross to Southern Ireland and to correspondent Ashna Huranag, who's at Dublin Airport for us at the moment, where President Biden is due to arrive in the next hour. Ashna, good to have you with us. I can see that people have started to assemble. There's some umbrellas up. Biden expected to arrive.
He is, and the world